Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzi Fay. Bloomsbury Book Bag, Bloomsbury author. I'm not sure this little book bag can even contain the energies of the author that I'm about to invite in. Frankly, it's terrifying. He's a best-selling historian. You've seen him on the telly. Gets up to all sorts of stuff. We're now talking about his new novels. He's writing a series of novels, but we'll talk about lots of things. I'm going to invite in. Have you guessed who it is yet? It is, of course, the amazing Dan Jones. Welcome, Dan.
I love that introduction. I love that introduction. That's a great compliment to say I wouldn't fit in a small bag.
Yeah, well,
yeah.
We won't keep you for long. I mean, I might just explode with excitement, to be quite honest.
No, you mustn't do that.
But I'll try not to. I'll keep it I'll keep a grip on myself. But I was looking, this is your latest book, and I was just looking at this also by Dan Jones. The Peasants' Revolt, The Plantagenets, The Hollow Crown, The Wars of the Roses, Magna Carta, A Year in the Life of Plantagenet England, The Rise and Fall of God's Holy Warriors, that's the Templars, Crusaders, An Epic History, A New History of the Middle Ages. I mean, it's mad, isn't it? Like, you're just
I've been going for a while. I mean, I started early. I started writing when I've just been 20 years. I'm 42 now. And it's nearly been 20 years, I think, since I first signed up with my agent, Georgina Capel, and started work on my first book. That actually came out I took ages over that one. That came out in 2009. That was the book on the Peasants' Revolt. But since then, I don't know, I've been on a bit of a roll. And I'm 42 now. I've sort of started to lose count of how many books I've published. So that I think we're at that stage. But I'm still enjoying it immensely, and in fact, it gets better and better and more fun. And I'm just even as I'm writing a book. I'm writing this trilogy of novels: Essex Dogs, Wolves of Winter, and the third one, which will be out in a couple of years. And I'm also writing a non-fiction book about Henry V. And I've got sort of 4 other ideas that I'm buzzing around my head at the moment. So I just feel like privileged to be able to write them.
Can I take you back, actually? When did this all start? Were you unwisely exposed to too many Welsh castles when you were a lad? When did the history bug bite?
No, I wasn't actually. So I wasn't the kid who was dragged around castles. All my family's from South Wales, and my sister and I used to be taken down to South Wales and sort of left with my grandparents for a couple of weeks every summer holidays while my parents worked, did their jobs. And we would castles were on the itinerary. I must have gone around Cardiff Castle and Raglan Castle and Castle Coch and all the sort of local castles, but there wasn't a sort of huge historical influence on my life when I was young. I had a very good teacher when I was in school. When I was about 15, 16, doing my GCSEs and then my A-levels, I had a really, really good teacher called Robin Green, who was my big inspiration, and I enjoyed history from that age. He really had this ability to make it come alive, biographically, almost cinematically in many ways, and he was just a really, really engaging and interesting teacher. So it was my favorite subject at school from that point onwards, and he encouraged me to go and read history at university. And then when I was at university, I encountered some very brilliant teachers and supervisors. So Helen Castor, the brilliant medievalist, was my first supervisor in my first year at university. I was later taught by Christine Carpenter, who was then the doyenne of English medieval studies. Christopher Clark taught me modern European history, and David Starkey taught me the Tudor papers, much to my director of studies irritation, they didn't want me to be taught by him at all. But I buttonholed David and begged him to supervise me. And he taught me really the foundations of writing a good sentence. So I was very lucky. That would be the age of 18, 19, 20. But it was always writing as much as history that interested me at that age. And then as I sort of moved into a professional career and realized I was pretty much good for nothing except writing, I just decided to write about what I liked, and that's become history. But it's also been, there was 10 years when I wrote a newspaper column about sport,
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah.
The writing, I'd write about just about anything for the love of it, but it's history where I've found the biggest pool, I suppose, of stories that engage and inspire me and engage and inspire my readers.
And when it comes to something like the Crusades, I mean, other histories of the Crusades are available.
Yeah.
Do you have to does every era need its new set of historians to write in a new, fresh way with a new perspective? Or are we simply learning more as time goes on?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes in both cases, I think. There are so many different parts to writing about history. I mean, there's the scholarly academic that tends towards micro studies. There's that way of writing about history. There's the sort of upmarket I'll name publishers, UK publishers, the sort of what I would call the Yale, or in the US, the Harvard University Press approach to writing history, where there is a sort of, it's more scholarly, but it's for a trade audience. There's where I occupy, which is somewhere more towards a middle ground, big popular audience than that. And then there's a much more sort of tabloidy way of writing about history. Then you get to the sort of horrible histories end of the spectrum, which is all about sort of castle toilets and and the gross stuff, which I'm there for as well. So there are lots of different avenues to write about history, and depending where you sit on that spectrum, it's like, how important is the latest research? If you're into academia, very important. If you're into horrible histories, not very important. I sit somewhere in the middle. The point about a new voice for every generation, I think that definitely helps. I think that our preferences as readers change as a society over time. The things that we're interested in about the past change over time. And so there are new approaches and new ways of writing about history that will seek to sort of bridge a gap between a modern audience and the subject matter of the past. I wouldn't say that I occupy myself too much with those thoughts when I'm picking subjects. I over the course of the last 20 years, I've just been drawn to subjects that interest me, and often that means subjects I feel like I could learn something about by writing about. So when I started writing about the Crusades, I did two sort of paired books about the Crusades. The first was the Templars, which was a good way to introduce myself to the subject of the Crusades within a relatively contained through story. And then I did the bigger book about the Crusades. Up until that point, I'd done Plantagenets, Wars of the Roses, Magna Carta. I'd done a lot of English late medieval history, and I sort of felt that I wanted to do something a bit more international. So it was as much a decision on my part that I would like to spend 3 or 4 or 5 years writing about the Crusades and learning about the Crusades and traveling around to Crusader sort of destinations, as it was a thought that, well, that this history needs a new voice for a new generation. I don't really think like that.
Did you go to places like Crac de Chevalier?
Crac de Chevalier, no, because at the time that I was writing Crusaders, the war in Syria made that a bit too hairy.
Yeah.
But I was in Jerusalem and Acre and places like that, which is a bit hairy to go to now. I'd spent some time in southern Spain. Mercifully, that's largely been a sort of reasonably safe place to go. That comes with it's part of the course when you're writing about the Crusades, that depending on the time you're writing about it, it's often the case that particularly in the Near East, Middle East, there's going to be places that are off limits.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, we'll get on to your new project of the last few years, which is writing fiction. So this is the second in the trilogy. It's always an interesting place to be, right in the middle of a trilogy. But the first one was called Essex Dogs. And I think, as I've said to you before, this has a sort of, that had to me a kind of soccer hooligan, whoa, Essex Dogs, come on, kind of feel to it. And this is the Wolves of Winter. It's got a bit more serious now.
Yeah.
So
it's the come down.
I'm sure the last one in the trilogy is gonna, have an amazing, a big bang, as it were. But yeah, did you find the story that you have picked, without wanting to leap onto volume 3, fell naturally into these 3 episodes?
Yes, it did, and that was the reason that I picked this period, this specific period or one of the reasons I picked this specific period to write this trilogy of novels about. I had an idea back in 2017. I had an idea to write a story set in the Middle Ages about a group of ordinary soldiers, and I worked then on some character notes and got nowhere with finding something for them to do. In 2019, I was in Normandy for New Year, and it was on New Year's Day 2019. I took a walk on Omaha Beach, as it's called since D-Day 1944, and got to thinking that actually in 1346 this had been or this stretch of coast. It was actually near a Utah beach, as it was called in 44. In 1346, this had been the stretch of coast where Edward III had landed 15,000 English troops for his invasion of Normandy. And wouldn't it be interesting to do some medieval novels that sort of felt like modern American war novels and war movies? Platoon, in movie terms, I'm thinking Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, Band of Brothers on the TV, Apocalypse Now, even. To have that sort of attack and energy built into a medieval novel felt like an interesting experiment. Felt like something fun that I could try my hand at. Would be a good way to introduce myself to writing fiction. I was sort of naturally led towards 1346 because of Edward's invasion of those beaches. I mean, it could have been set in 1415 with Henry V, the Agincourt campaign. But what attracted me, or sort of kept me in the 1346, 47, 48, 49 territory was the fact that this sort of fell into a tripartite arrangement. So in 1346, Edward III lands 15,000 men on the beaches of Normandy. They march, they fight, they march, they fight. You have the Battle of Crécy. That felt like, okay, that's a volume. Subsequently, the same army moves on their way back home to the coast, and they go to Calais and besiege Calais. There's a sort of 11-month siege, a kind of medieval Stalingrad. That struck me as a natural second volume, and then you'd have a battle and a siege. The third volume, which I'm plotting and tinkering with at the moment as I write this biography, will probably take place in the first 8 months of 1350. So it'll be a post-Black Death. We'll jump forward a couple of years to the other side of the Black Death of 1348-9, and have the big set piece, I imagine, will be the Battle of Winchelsea, a sea battle. So you've got land battle, siege, sea battle. And that's always been in my head. That's what we're going to do. And that's what I'm going to do. And that felt neat. And like you'd have 3 different flavors for the 3 different novels of the trilogy bound together by a set of characters.
Absolutely. I mean, what I love about this is that they are stuck. So the dogs are this bunch of characters. I don't know whether you'd call them mercenaries particularly. They fight for king and country, but they fight for money as well.
Yeah, there's sort of mercenary, freebooter, just, roughneck. Yeah, and you mentioned football hooligans early on, and that was a big point of reference for me, particularly writing Essex Dogs. Like, they're just the lads on tour, and they've gone to earn a bit of money, and the books are really about sussing out what they're there for. And they think they're there for money, and some of them never get beyond that. Others of them find that they're there for different reasons or have different motivations thrust upon them.
I mean, what I thought was really interesting was the psychology of warfare, and the fact that it's actually exciting in what might possibly be a rather dull medieval existence of, I don't know, feeding the pigs or something. You get to travel, you meet all sorts of exciting people, up to and including royalty. There are some military commanders, specifically Earl of Northampton. I'm sure we're going to talk about him later, but he's quite fond of the dogs. I mean, he will sort of see them encamped and sort of go, "Oh, 6 dogs, how are you doing?" how did you sort of build the world picture? Because one of the new things I think we want from history is not top down. We want bottom up, don't we?
Yeah, it's about. I worked with a great TV director called Douglas McKinnon a few years. I mean, around the time actually that I first started thinking about this project, it was back in 2017. And Douglas had a great rule of storytelling, which really stuck with me. And he said, if you're having trouble telling a story, just lock the camera onto one person's shoulder. And something of that message has come through in the writing of Essex Dogs. It's a way of seeing a familiar story, this part of the 100 Years' War, by locking the camera, as it were, with a different character or a set of characters. So the story of the Battle of Crécy in particular, and the Siege of Calais to an extent, is known through various tableaux, various like set pieces, various sort of picturesque scenes, be they the arrival of the English army on the beaches of Normandy and Edward III tripping over and bloodying his nose and saying, look, you see, the land wants me, or at the end of Wolves of Winter, the end of the story of the Siege of Calais, we may know Auguste Rodin's famous sculpture of the burghers of Calais coming with the nooses around their necks and the keys to the city. They're sort of famous as a linked series of tableaux, but generally seen through the eyes of the well-to-do. I thought, what does this story look like if you just lock the camera with the ordinary folk? So that's the starting principle, that you see everything through the eyes of the dogs. However, it's in terms of telling the story, you don't want to not have the king at all. Not have the Black Prince at all, and not have any nobles whatsoever, because thematically part of the story that's germane to and organic to telling a story through the eyes of ordinary people is how do they interact with their quote unquote social betters. And thematically running through the whole trilogy is this question of what are we all here for? And the answer in the 100 Years' War is, well, a bunch of different stuff. I mean, the dogs are there for money, for each other, for survival. But you need to compare and contrast that, I feel, with other motivations. So Essex Dogs, the first book in the trilogy, is very much about the collision of that the dog's mentality with that of most of the earls and princes and knights who are there for some sort of reasons of pecuniary gain, but largely because chivalry, and that war is a natural vehicle for them to do heroic things, which is what they're born and trained to do. And the thematic question underpinning the kind of exciting high octane adventure is like, who's right? Is anyone right? Is either one of those points of view on war any more valid or true than the other? And what happens when you bash them into each other? Wolves of Winter introduces another motivation for being there, seen through the eyes of a character called the Captain primarily, but also a pirate called Jean Morand, who are there for the money, and the merchants who are there, they want Calais because it's a great trading port. So, you have to introduce those bigger characters in order to get those viewpoints across. But it's also fun. I mean, these are mass market, like entertaining novels, and a character like the Earl of Northampton, William de Boon, Earl of Northampton, I've had in many ways is my favorite of the non-dogs characters, because he represents nobility, chivalry on the one hand, but in his person he's sort of quite ill-suited to that role. By birth it's his, but he's kind of he's sort of coarse, foul-mouthed. He knows exactly, he can navigate perfectly the world of the upper classes, and we see him in Essex Dogs speaking truth to the King Edward III because they've known each other since they were young lads. He can speak to him in the language of the court. He can navigate that world perfectly, but he's one of the very few of the upper classes who can also talk to the dogs in their own language, or at least in a mutually comprehensible language. And that's an interesting character for me, and I've given him, I say I've given him, but really the experience of writing novels is that the characters, when they're working, take on lives of their own pretty quickly. He has taken for himself a sort of lingo of his own, a language, a swagger of his own, that I enjoy writing immensely. And I've been saying and thinking, as I contemplate the sort of the future of this Essex Dogs kind of world, that he's the character most likely to have his own kind of Better Call Saul spin-off series.
I'm here for it. I'm here for it.
He's
was
great
thinking
fun.
maybe Russell Crowe could play him.
Yeah, Crowe's got a chance. Crowe's definitely got a chance. He was based. I mean, the first inspiration for him was a football manager called Neil Warnock, specialist in helping Premier League sides avoid relegation. You know, I'm a big sports fan, and I was thinking, I want this kind of authority figure who has a sort of the common touch. And I don't know, I was sitting in front of my computer one day. I was like, this is Neil Warnock. I'd seen a video, like a sort of viral video, years ago, where it had been the end of season. A team Warnock was managing had underperformed, and he'd going around the dressing room, really laying into them, coarse, foul-mouthed, but kind of speaking their language, and also going, "I love you, boys." You know, it's this strange, like, he's the boss, he's angry with them, but he also loves them. He's a bit like cracked, basically. So Warnock was my first inspiration for the Earl of Northampton. But I mean, that's very deep. I don't think anybody could have guessed that from reading him on the page. It was just, that was the kind of inspiration for me for making him.
Do you remember when we did the event recently at Waterstones here in London? I said something like, I really like the Earl of Northampton, and a woman in the audience went, "Yes, me too." So yeah. I think he's, it might be slightly disturbing for you to think this, but I think he might be a bit of a hit with the ladies.
It's peculiar. You know, it's peculiar because of course this is all new to me. I've written several non-fiction books. I don't know how many it is, 12, 13, and only 2 novels to date. And you really get quite that same reaction writing non-fiction. I would say possibly with the exception of when I did The Wars of the Roses, you get a few people frothing over Richard III, but that's a sort of special case in a way. So to have been, I've just come back from book tour for Wolves of Winter, and 2 books in, people are really connecting with certain of the characters and really like deeply emotionally connecting with these characters as entities of their own, of standalone. And so it is peculiar to think, that's something I made up. It's like a weird bit of my mind you seem to have fallen in love with inadvertently. But that's, hey, wow, I guess that's what writing fiction is, right? It's a very, very strange and beautiful experience.
Well, we also did an event for the first book for Essex Dogs. I think that was at Oxford. And you and I said, I like the Earl of Northampton, and you said, I think you mean the Earl of Warwick. And I went, no, Northampton. And you went, no, Warwick, the charming one. And I went, no.
Yeah, I'd got you all wrong, Suzi, hadn't I? I don't know why I was bothering. I don't know why I even thought that. You're so obviously a Northampton kind of fangirl.
Well, without labouring this point too much, it seems to me, certainly in this novel, that there are things that we can extrapolate about the present day. And obviously you can't step out of time, and nobody likes a novel that is ahistoric and has things that don't, modern attitudes. But I mean, there's what they would not have known as PTSD. But I feel as this sort of saga carries on, they're stuck outside Calais. Loveday, who in many ways is a central character and a very appealing character, is starting to get the jitters, isn't he?
Absolutely.
How much were you thinking about things like PTSD? It obviously existed before there was a name for it.
I wanted to write about, Loveday at the start of the trilogy comes over thinking, this is just another campaign, and very quickly realizes that something's like slipped inside him, and that this might be one campaign too many. And as the book goes on, the key moment really in it is in the first book, it's the siege battle of Caen, where he loses a comrade, and he also breaks his hand. And that was and both were important, but weirdly, him breaking his hand was the most important. He punches someone, he breaks his hand. And it struck me, having hung around in enough rough pubs to have seen and even experienced people punching each other, if you punch someone and you will probably break your hand if you punch them hard enough in the head, or if they punch you hard enough in the head, they'll probably break their hand. And certainly, if you're wearing armor, they are going to break their hand. And Loveday breaks his hand. And if you've broken a bone, this isn't Hollywood. It doesn't heal. And if you don't get it set properly, I mean, my dad punched someone in a pub in Cumbraen when he was 18, and he's had his entire wrist replaced in his old life because it didn't set properly, right? So Loveday starts to wear the scars, wear his injuries, literally, and then that manifests throughout book 2. It really starts to eat away at him mentally, and I felt that was probably a realistic depiction of a man at war, or of this man at war. It did not seem incongruous, and it certainly didn't seem like I was picking some kind of modern example of war trauma and parachuting him into the Middle Ages. It seemed to me that this was probably an eternal facet, an eternal example from warfare. I'm very careful to avoid not only using but even thinking in kind of modern terms and modern labels when I'm writing these books, because the part of the trick of creating an environment that feels like it's the 14th century is to try and block out of your mind anything that's not the 14th century as far as possible. And so I was never writing Loveday thinking, okay, let's look up symptoms of PTSD and now 14th centuryify them. I'm just like trying to psychologically follow through what my best guess is he will feel when put in extreme circumstances, given the psychological makeup that he has. He's a deeply caring, empathetic, self-torturing stress head. And the more he, in a way, like the more he hurts, if he can take on the pain for other people, he will do that. And there's a very simple elemental Christianity to him that's not expressed at this point in the trilogy in religious terms. But there's also just a sort of basic human, fatherly, avuncular, one of the two, goodness to him. And when bad things happen, it really like eats him up in a way that it doesn't eat up some of the other characters. Some of the other characters, it bounces off them. They get hurt, they fix themselves. For him, he's scarring up pretty easily now. He's a sad and difficult character to write, and it's like it's sort of heartbreaking sometimes writing Loveday, but it's also heartwarming at the same time, because he is the sort of he's the hero, but he's a pretty busted up kind of hero.
He's the leader of the dogs, and he takes it seriously. And hasn't his wife died back home, so he doesn't have things back home to keep him.
That's right, and that's part of his sort of his crisis while he's at war. The others, they have people back home, most of them, that they either do or don't want to ever see again. Loveday has people he wants to see again at home, but they're not alive anymore. And it's only as he enters this story in books 1 and 2 that he's confronted with this. He's never sort of thought very much about wanting to go home before. He's assumed that he'll either get home or he won't get home. And when he gets home, there'll be someone waiting for him. And sometimes it's nice to be away on tour with the lads, and then it's nice to go home. Well, now he's in a situation where it's not nice to be on tour with the lads anymore. And he wants to go home, but he suspects that when he gets home, it's actually going to be worse, because there's nothing there either. All he has is this band of kind of misfits that he's out in France with. And yet they're having the worst time ever, by and large. And that's a big part of his crisis.
There's a curious character, again, one of the noble characters, who's wearing a kind of strange red wig.
So Hugh Hastings,
yeah, Hugh Hastings, who's also, I mean, another aspect of the story is here we are at the gates of Calais. What are we going to need? Brothels. A city grows up outside the gates as this as the siege continues, and Hastings, I think I'm right in saying he's quite involved in all of this, isn't he? So it's not just let's get stuck in.
No, well, the story. So the story of Wolves of Winter. Yeah, well, quite. The story of Wolves of Winter is very different from the story of Essex Dogs in many ways. Like Essex Dogs is about a march, a march and a battle in its very elemental forms. In Wolves of Winter, the army goes pretty much straight away to Calais, and then there's an 11-month siege, and they sit in Calais. This is the history. They're there for so long that the English build a siege town on the marshes outside Calais. This is late 1346, and then they live in it in the winter of 1346 to 1347, in fact all the way up to the summer of 1347, trying to break this city into submission by various different means. And we have again, this is historical, brilliant description by the chronicler Jean Froissart of what this siege town, this wooden town on the marshes outside the walls and moats of Calais looked like. And he says it has markets and stables and municipal buildings and everything you would expect to find in any other English town. In fact, it's probably bigger than any other English town except London at the height of its population, about 30,000 people living there. And he says it has everything you would expect to see in a normal town. Now, I'd read a wonderful book called The Medieval Underworld, which is about the sort of seamier side of medieval life. And for me, that obviously includes kind of boozers and brothels. And so part of the story of Essex Dogs, of Wolves of Winter, which in which I wanted to push the dogs pretty close to the abyss of how bad a medieval siege could have been, is that they end up living for a time in a room above a brothel. That brothel is sort of operates under the protection of a sort of knightly nobleman called Sir Hugh Hastings. Now that part is fictional license, but Sir Hugh Hastings was a very real individual, and almost all of his characteristics, as described in Wolves of Winter, are drawn from known historical evidence, including his career. He'd been a steward for Queen Philippa of Hainaut, Edward III's wife. He'd run her household for a bit. He appears off screen in Essex Dogs because there's always this talk of this psycho Hugh Hastings who's got a little army burning its way through Flanders. That was exactly what he was doing at the time he's depicted doing it in Essex Dogs. He shows up in Wolves of Winter wearing a preposterous wig made of cowhide. That is absolutely true. When he's got a very famous grave in the village of Elsing in Norfolk, in the church there. It's famous because it has one of the most wonderful 14th century memorial brasses of Hugh Hastings in full armor. So his physical description is partly drawn from his appearance on the armor, but it's partly drawn from a study that was published in 1970 in the Norfolk Archaeological Journal, because his grave was opened in the 70s as the repairs were being made to the area of the church around his tomb, and they accidentally dug into his grave, so they had a look. And he had signs of having lived an extremely violent life, talking of punching people. He was missing teeth. He had like old fractures to his skull. He had been literally in the wars. And right by his head was what appears to be a wig made of cowhide. So and it says in the article, there's a possibility it's a hat. I chose to believe it was a wig because that possibility was mooted and nobody can really argue with it. And so there he is. He turns up, and he's always, once you've given a character a wig made of cowhide in a novel, I mean, he's always sort of turning it around and repositioning it on his head, and it just becomes a sort of a part of him. It's like this Sir Thomas Holland turns up as well. And again, this is part of the real description of the real Sir Thomas Holland. He'd lost an eye fighting the pagans in Prussia on one of the Northern Crusades, and so he wears a patch. And so it's he's once you've got a character like that, he's got the peculiar habit in Essex Dogs of winking at people, and it's obviously the eye he's always used to wink, which is the good eye, but it's this odd thing where he's winking with his one eye, and they're all slightly unnerved by the appearance of this. Now those things which draw on real historical attributes, physical characteristics. Were I writing a non-fiction book, that's maybe a footnote. It might make its way into one line of text. It's just a sort of statement of fact. But in a novel, it's what you can build whole characters out of. A guy. What is it? What does it say about a guy if he's so vain that he's prepared to wear a wig made out of cowhide? What do you do with a guy who's got this sort of this patch from fighting the pagans? How does that feed into his character? So. For me, because all of this is new to me, Suzi, I'm still having enormous fun and like finding. I'm sure for all the other great historical fiction writers out there who've written sort of 20, 30, 40, 50 novels. This is old news, but I'm like still, fresh faced and innocent and enjoying it.
You mentioned Queen Philippa, who has an extraordinary effect, certainly on Loveday. Why does she turn up? I mean, it's quite strange to think of a medieval queen going, I'll just go and have a look at that siege. What do we know about her in history, and how did you use her as a figure here?
Well, she turns up because she turns up in the history, and I'm oh, hold on, sorry, give me 1 second. My computer was threatening to shut down. That wouldn't be good. So she turns up because she turns up in history. And, my approach to doing this historical fiction is, wherever possible, include the beats of the history. And then the task of writing the fiction is to find your way between them in a credible, non-jarring way. Her husband had been there for a while, and turning up on campaign would have been somewhat inappropriate, but once they're settled and they've built an entire town and it's not that far from England, she turns up. And there are descriptions of the siege town of Villeneuve-l'Hardy where there are spectator stands so that the Queen and her court can, they can watch. Because if there's going to be an attempt on the walls, I mean, they're not going to join in, but it might be jolly fun to have a look. And so there's a big set piece within Wolves of Winter where they do precisely that, where Loveday and a couple of the others of the dogs are trying to scramble up ladders to assault the walls of Calais, and they can hear the cheering in the background and jolly good, sort of clapping from the stands. That struck me as an incredibly bizarre and slightly creepy approach to warfare, but one that would say a lot, that would show a lot about the themes I'm trying to explore in the books. And of course, she also turns up because Edward III is still a relatively young king, and he's in the process of fathering a large royal family. So she turns up to carry on that process. And in fact, by the end of the Siege of Calais, she's heavily pregnant.
There's something very interesting that you also do in the first book, which is when royals are around, they kind of change the entire atmosphere around them. There's something special happens. Even, I mean, the Black Prince is a bit of a dick in your telling, actually, but they almost change the weather around them as soon as they appear, and I think that's tremendously interesting, because just the power and prestige of the royals. So a queen turning up, it profoundly influences people, and I found that was interesting.
Well, that was something else that I'd learned when I was working with the director I mentioned earlier, Douglas MacKinnon. In 2017, I was working on this big costume drama set in the 14th century, and I was advising the whole operation, the cast, the crew, every department. And so I was there on set a lot, and I worked a lot with the directors and the assistant directors. And doing that, you get into questions of how should people react in certain situations, and they ask questions that as a historian you usually never bother yourself with, such as, who opens the door? King's walking along, who opens the door? And you go, I don't know, let me find out. But one of the things we talked about a lot And this really stuck with me. I can remember vividly the conversation where we sat around in Douglas's office in the studio in pre-production, saying, "What happens when the king walks into a room?" And you've got the first AD there saying, "Yeah, I'll have 200 extras packing out this courtroom scene in episode 3 or whatever it is. King and Queen are going to walk in. How do I direct the extras? How do they physically react when this person comes along?" And we watched how it had been done a lot. And one of the scenes that I remember Douglas pulling out and playing a couple of times was, I think it was from The Madness of King George, the movie, where the king is sort of striding along through the palace, and there's a kind of royal flunky, like bowing and scraping, walking backwards perfectly. Has completely mastered the art of walking backwards so that he can always face the king and bow and scrape on the move. And that piece of visual grammar tells you so much about the whole world that you're stepping into. And that was a great lesson to me in terms of thinking about the mechanic, well, about history. But when I came to start writing historical fiction, the sort of general lesson of that was, these are all people we're writing about, but remember that they're going to have peculiar effects on one another as they walk into a building. I've got I've got teenage daughters, and one only has to imagine how they would have reacted a couple of years ago at the height of their love of One Direction if Harry Styles had walked into the house. They'd have physically acted different. Or if right now, if there was a knock at the door and my 14-year-old went to answer it and there was Taylor Swift, asking for directions to the library or whatever, she wouldn't just say, "Oh yeah, down the road, turn left." She'd probably fall on the floor and burst into tears and start, having the conniptions. So the same principle I've tried to apply where possible and appropriate in writing historical fiction, particularly in a hierarchical, royal, religious setting like the one that I'm writing about.
I don't want you to give anything away necessarily, but it is very interesting the way that you've characterized the Black Prince.
Right.
He's very young, so we sort of forget that he's about 16, I think, in the first.
He is, yeah.
So why have you made him as spoilt and difficult as he is, and is he possibly going to change and mature in book 3? Is he even in book 3?
He'll be in book 3. Although to how foregrounded, I can't quite say at the moment. So look, in the Black Prince's character, which is sort of set up in Essex Dogs when he's 16 years old, was to an extent informed by my thinking about where he had to end up at the end of that book. And I don't think this is going to be a terrible spoiler, so nobody need really cover their ears. It's the one of the most famous things anyone knows about the Battle of Crecy, if they know anything at all about it, is that this was the battle where the Black Prince, the 16-year-old eldest son of the King of England, Edward III, got into terrible trouble on the battlefield and was on the brink of being captured. And the news was reported to his father, who was commanding the battle from a windmill at the back of the field, where he had a high vantage point over the fighting. "Sire, sire, your son's in terrible trouble." And the father says, "Let him win his spurs." Let him get himself out of this mess. That always struck me as a very, very odd thing. And if true, and I decided to assume it were true because it's such a famous vignette, needs some explaining. And if the explanation is not a wholehearted, unquestioning belief in chivalry as a real sort of code that matters more than anything else, and for which all our characters optimize unthinkingly, if we're a little bit more complex and human than that, then there has to be a reason why the king would say this. And it seemed to me that if you've got a 16-year-old given command of the vanguard of the army, the most plausible explanation for his father saying this after 7 weeks of him doing it is that he's just been intolerable and his father's had enough. Completely had enough of his bullshit. And maybe that's the parent in me speaking, like, okay, I'm done with the guy. Just let him sort himself out. He thinks he's a big man. And so working back from that point was the, I suppose, the genesis of what is the Black Prince like at this age. It didn't seem absurd to me for a 16-year-old prince in charge of the vanguard of the army to be a brat. It certainly seems like it had great dramatic potential because, as you've suggested, Susie, it would allow him to grow and change, maybe in a positive direction over the course of the books. Although my historical opinion on the Black Prince is probably less awestruck than some. This is, after all, a man who, in the prime of his life, massacred entire cities. So the idea that he might have been a little bit of a bastard when he was a kid did not seem strange. If that's where he's, beyond the scope of this trilogy, where he's going to end up. He's a guy who married his first cousin and produced the most psychotic king in medieval history, in Richard II. Like, all of this seemed, and the other thing, of course, is that nobody can tell me otherwise, because nobody knows the first damn thing about the Black Prince's character when he was a kid. If you go to any biography of him, childhood is skipped over remarkably quickly because nobody paid much attention to his, his psychological profile as a kid. So you got a free hit as a novelist, really, to make of him what you will. And his he's a repulsive character, and I think he's sort of bratty and horrid in book one, but he's verging on callous and evil in book two. That's not to say, he's spiraling towards true, demon status in book three, because he's going to have grown up somewhat in book three. But he's definitely got those bits of his personality that are going to be lurking around in him from here on in.
He's the prince who got the Prince of Wales feathers, isn't he? That's why the Prince of Wales symbol.
Well, that's the story.
Is, yeah.
So the story goes. The story goes that at the Battle of Crécy, one of the royals fighting on the French side was blind King John of Bohemia, who, as the name suggests, like blind Willie McTell, the blues singer. The guy was blind. I think it may have been fighting the pagans as well. I forget now. But anyway, one of the great heroic vignettes of the Battle of Crécy, or another one of them, is blind King John of Bohemia, great warrior, demanding to be taken into the midst of the fighting. Everyone's going, "You sure that's a good idea? Remember, you're called blind King John for a reason." He says, no. He changed himself to his men, and he's led into the battle and is cut down. And then, when his body is found by the English after the battle, everyone's, "Oh my goodness, that was the most chivalric, heroic thing we've ever seen." And his symbol was ostrich feathers, and so it's said that the Black Prince, Edward Woodstock, Black Prince, takes those feathers and then incorporates them into his own badge, and that's why the Prince of Wales is still represented by ostrich feathers and the medieval German inscription Ich dien. So I've got a funny feeling that some spoil sport historians, he says with his fictional cap on, have ruined that story and said, "No, it's not really like that." Well, it's like that in Essex Dogs, because everyone thinks it's like that, and that. But that's actually one of the things you've got to remember if you're writing these kind of historical novels where you're playing with what you hope people might know about the history. There are Easter eggs and jokes for people who think they know their history of the Battle of Crécy. It doesn't do not to include blind King John of Bohemia and his ostrich feathers and the Black Prince just because some historian said it might not be true. The trick is to put a twist on that story. So the twist in Essex Dogs is that the Black Prince is not immediately impressed by this whatsoever, and in fact thinks Blind King John of Bohemia is a total sort of wanker for having done this. But you know, like we're getting into the realm of spoilers at this point.
Yeah, well, there's twists and Easter eggs, certainly in Wolves of Winter, because you have your historical note at the end. So that kind of shows how ingeniously you've blended everything.
Well, it's important in Wolves of Winter because I think the story of the Siege of Calais, which is what Wolves is about, is a lot less well known than the story of Crecy, and also because the real story of the Siege of Calais is so wild. I was worried that people will think that when I've got a bunch of pirates led by a guy called Jean Maron, who runs his pirate gang out of a pub called the Tin Jar, they'll be like, he's just making all this up. No, that stuff's true. So I had to put the historical note in so people go, wait, what? What? This isn't made up. No, this is the real history. The brothel's made up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, Scotsman, one of the characters called Scotsman, he's very ingeniously folded into the real history. But listen, I know that you do have to scoot off and write another 4,000 words before tea time, probably.
I literally do. I do.
So I'm going to wrap up. I mean, we've only touched on, you know, there's pirates, there's guns, there's drugs, there's terrible things happening in cathedrals, on altars, all sorts of stuff going on in this amazing book, Wolves of Winter. But I'm going to wrap up with my 3 last questions.
Of course, yes, you must.
First, what is your favourite artwork?
My favorite. Well, if I'm going into the National Gallery, because say I get the train into London to go to the London Library, which is St James, I've got to walk from Waterloo over the river through Trafalgar Square. I'll often hang a right and go into the National Gallery to look at the Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck. I'm a real sucker for that sort of early Dutch Renaissance painting, Boots, Van Eyck, Rogier van der Weyden. But probably the Arnolfini portrait is my favorite because Van Eyck plays these wild tricks in it. There's particularly with the mirror, where you look in the mirror and where you expect to see Van Eyck, you see a bunch of people who aren't Van Eyck. And so he's mastered perspective, he's mastered depth, he's mastered this new way of painting with oils, and yet then he hides himself like a ghost. It's absolutely brilliant. I'm also very fond of the Wilton diptych, which is close by in the National Gallery. But I think it's the Arnolfini portrait for me. I've written a mad ghost story about the Arnolfini portrait, which I've never published. But I'm quite obsessed with it.
Ah, wonderful. Well, I hope we'll see that someday. What have you not read that's slightly shameful?
I've never read any Jane Austen, ever. I've never even seen a Jane Austen novel adapted on television. I've no idea what it's all about. And it's got to the point. It's a bit like I've never seen Top Gun, the movie. It's got to the point where I could easily go and read a Jane Austen novel now or watch one of them. But it's got to the point where it's sort of become like part of my personality, and I don't know if I'd change in some fundamental way if I went and did it. I'm actually in the process of setting up a little book club with a few of my friends who are also willing to admit to not having read the classics. We're going to call the illiterati, and we will read some of the classics and discuss them. But in order to join, you've got to be, I think you've got to be sort of confident, high achieving Illuminati type person, but also have this deep gap in you that you've never read. I don't know, Bleak House or whatever. I've never read Bleak House either.
That's really good.
I definitely don't dispute. It's not. I didn't not read it because I didn't think it was good. I haven't had time. I've read all of Knausgaard, if that helps. It took me ages.
Wow, all of Knausgaard and
this is good stuff.
Jane
I like
Austen.
it. Well, like spreading liver paste on the bread and getting his dick stuck in a bottle.
Oh, it's just like the Netherfield Ball and the incident on Box Hill. I mean, it's.
I'm a big fan of Knausgaard. So, but it takes time. I haven't got time to read Jane Austen. Reading about a depressed Norwegian man, for God's sake.
Fair dues. Okay, and finally, have you ever had any weird bizarre, funny feedback on your work, whether it's your books or TVs or TV shows, whatever.
Suzi, there's like it's like I'm going to dip my hand in the brand tub of weird stuff, and I might pull out, oh, another person has mistaken me for Dan Snow.
Oh, right, okay.
But that's like everyday run of the mill stuff. Kind of the weird. Someone got my face tattooed on their belly, and so yeah, I mean, maybe in my top 5 there was a time I was giving a talk and I was doing a signing at the end. This is a fair while ago, and a bunch of people had come to the talk all wearing a mask of my face, and it turned out it was a stag do. It was really weird. Like, but that was a little unnerving, but they were okay. And they actually gave me a mask of my own face and made me wear it and take a photo with them. That was just pretty weird. That was like, they did it because I think they liked my stuff or whatever. It was pretty weird when someone got my face tattooed on their belly, because it was next to the radio DJ Christian O'Connell, who had a show on Virgin Radio. It's just me and Christian on a guy's
belly,
lower belly, splash zone, if you know what I'm talking about.
And
reasonable likeness, but like definitely an old photo. It's just, do you class that as feedback? I don't know. Like, it's saying something, isn't it?
Yeah, you just won that question. Nobody will ever have a better answer to that
never
question.
Say never. I mean, we might do another one of these interviews one day, and something else weird might have happened.
Oh.
That's not even the weirdest thing. Like, the weirdest stuff has happened, but I get all Love Day PTSD talking about it. So I have to have a few drinks to get into it.
Yeah. It's too early for that. And on that bombshell, on that shocking note, you pretty much have blown the book bag apart at the seams. It's in shreds.
You can get another one.
I've got loads of book bags, actually.
Yeah,
they're all down there. I've got hundreds of them.
I don't doubt it.
Thank you so much. Dan Jones, Wolves of Winter yet again. Fantastic stuff. Earl of Northampton forever. Thank you very much for joining me, Dan. It's been an absolute treat.
Yeah, such a pleasure. Thanks, Suzi.
Cheers. And thank you for watching. Wasn't that amazing? Please like and subscribe. If you don't like that one, you are dead inside. I'm sorry. But anyway, next week I will be back. I'll have somebody else. I'm really going to have to work hard to find somebody with as great stories as Dan just had. And I'm now going to go and have a bit of a lie down. Thanks for watching. Bye.